still. The automatic doors sighed behind me as I sat in the wheelchair, fresh from surgery, my phone heavy in my hand with no one answering. As the doors kept opening and closing, I adjusted the blanket over my legs instead of calling again, telling myself they were just running late. While each soft hiss echoed through the lobby, it grew louder than the pain, louder than the excuses I kept rehearsing for them. The same sound followed my thoughts as I watched other families leave together and realized no one was scanning the room for me. As the doors opened once more without my name being called, it hit me that this wasn't delay, it was a decision. That's when, to that familiar hiss, I decided I'd stop waiting to be rescued and start paying attention to what their absence revealed. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Hank surfaced from the anesthesia the way a man comes up from deep water, slowly, lungs burning, mind fogged at the edges. The ceiling above him was a grid of dull white panels, one of them stained slightly brown near a vent. He focused on that stain because it stayed still. Everything else felt like it was drifting. His body ached in a broad, muted way, as if the pain hadn't decided yet where to land. He swallowed, his throat dry, and waited for the room to stop tilting. A nurse noticed his eyes open and moved into his line of sight. She smiled, professional and practiced, the kind of smile meant to reassure without promising too much. "Mr. Miller," she said gently, checking the monitor beside him. "Surgery went well. You did fine." The words landed slowly, but they landed. Surgery went well. That was the part he'd been afraid of for weeks, the unknown, the table, the waiting. Now it was behind him. Relief crept in, thin but real. He shifted slightly and felt a sharp reminder in his abdomen, but it only confirmed he was still here, still alive. A little later, after vitals and paperwork and the dull routine of recovery, another nurse came by with a clipboard. "You're cleared to be discharged today," she said, "as soon as your ride gets here." That word, ride, felt simple, automatic. Hank nodded, already reaching for his phone. Ethan would be nearby. He always was. Or at least, that's what Hank had believed when he agreed to the surgery date. He dialed his son's number, holding the phone close to his ear, listening to the hollow ringing echo against the quiet beeps of machines around him. It rang 4 times, then slid into voicemail. He frowned, not worried yet. Meetings ran long. Traffic happened. He didn't leave a message. He hung up and tried again a few minutes later. Same result. Straight to voicemail, like the phone hadn't even bothered to look for Ethan before giving up. Hank scrolled to Lena's name and pressed call. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice clipped, distracted. There was noise in the background, voices, movement, life, happening somewhere else. "Hey, Lena," Hank said, forcing lightness into his tone. "They're discharging me. I'm ready whenever you are." There was a pause, just long enough to feel calculated. "Oh," she said. "We're actually really busy today." Busy. The word sat there between them, vague and unmoving. Hank waited for more, for an explanation, a question, a follow-up. None came. "I can wait," he offered. "They said, I just need someone to take me home." Another pause. "Yeah, I don't think that's going to work right now," she said. "Maybe later." Then she was gone. The call ended before he could respond. A nurse returned with a wheelchair and helped him into it, careful, efficient. "We'll take you down to the discharge area," she said. "Your family should meet you there." Hank nodded, phone still in his hand, screen dark now. He told himself it was temporary, a misunderstanding. He was groggy, after all. Things would make sense in a few minutes. They parked him near the exit, a wide glass wall separating the hospital from the world outside. Automatic doors slid open and shut as people came and went. He watched them from his chair. A middle-aged woman leaned into her husband, laughing softly as he steadied her. A younger man pushed an elderly woman carefully, her hand wrapped tight around his arm. Names were called. Hugs were exchanged. Promises of soup and rest floated through the air. Time stretched. His back began to ache from the chair. The pain medication thinned, leaving sharper edges behind. He checked his phone again. No missed calls, no texts. Hours passed in fragments, shifting light through the glass, the change of staff, the sound of rolling carts. Day staff filtered out, replaced by night shift. No one said anything to him. They assumed, as he had, that someone was coming. Eventually, a nurse paused in front of him, glancing at the empty space beside the wheelchair. "Who's picking you up, Mr. Miller?" Hank straightened a little. "They're on the way," he said automatically. The lie slipped out smooth, almost practiced. The nurse nodded and moved on. Left alone again, Hank watched another family disappear through the doors. The last of the afternoon crowd thinned, and with it, the illusion that this was normal. Something cold settled in his chest, heavier than the pain. It wasn't anger yet. It wasn't even fear. It was the slow, sinking realization that he was sitting exactly where he'd been left, and no one was in a hurry to come back for him. The light outside the glass doors dimmed from afternoon glare to a washed-out gray, then deepened toward blue. Somewhere behind Hank, a television murmured low news headlines no one seemed to be watching. The air felt cooler now, sharper against his skin. He noticed it because everything else had gone quiet. Fewer footsteps, fewer voices. The hospital, like the day, was slowly handing itself over tonight. A different nurse approached him this time. She moved with a steadier, less hurried rhythm. Her hair pulled back, her face lined in a way that suggested she'd seen plenty of long nights like this. Her badge read Carla Reyes. She stopped in front of Hank's wheelchair and glanced at the clipboard in her hands, then at him. "Mr. Miller," she said, not unkindly. "You're still waiting on your ride?" Hank lifted his eyes to hers. For a brief second, something like concern flickered across her face before she smoothed it away. He understood that look. It was the look people gave when they were about to confirm something neither of you wanted to say out loud. "They're on the way," Hank replied. His voice came out even, almost convincing. He surprised himself with how easily the words formed. The lie felt necessary, like armor. Saying the truth that no one had shown up, that he didn't know why, felt like an admission he wasn't ready to make. Carla studied him for a moment longer than the other nurses had. Her eyes dropped briefly to the thin hospital bracelet on his wrist, then to the phone resting in his hand. She nodded once. "All right," she said. "Let me know if anything changes." She walked off, her shoes quiet against the polished floor. Hank exhaled slowly. His lower back throbbed now, the chair unforgiving. He shifted, then stopped when pain flared sharper than before. He reached for his phone again, thumb hovering over Ethan's name. Before he could press call, the screen lit up on its own. A text message. "Ethan, can't make it tonight." That was it. 5 words. No greeting, no apology, no explanation. Hank stared at the message, reading it once, then again, as if more might appear if he waited long enough. His thumb hovered over the keyboard, unsure what to type. "Are you okay? What happened? I need you." None of it felt right. None of it felt like it would matter. He locked the screen without replying. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It pressed in on him from all sides, filling the space where expectation had been. He thought of the surgery that morning, of lying on the gurney as he was wheeled away, trusting that when it was over, his son would be there. Not because it was convenient, because it was what family did. Apparently, that assumption had expired. Minutes ticked by. Carla returned, her expression more serious now. "Mr. Miller," she said quietly, crouching slightly so they were eye level. "It's getting late. If your family isn't coming, we can arrange medical transport to take you home." Medical transport. The words landed hard. They carried weight, implication. They were for people who didn't have someone else. Hank swallowed. "How long does that take?" he asked. "Not long," she said. "I'll make the call." He nodded, because nodding was easier than admitting anything. As she walked away, Hank felt something shift inside him. Subtle, but irreversible. This wasn't a delay anymore. This wasn't traffic or bad timing. Ethan hadn't said later. He hadn't said tomorrow. He'd said, "Can't make it tonight." As if tonight were optional. As if Hank were optional. A transport orderly appeared not long after, polite but distant, already treating this as routine. Papers were signed. Instructions were repeated. No one asked where his family was now. The assumption had changed. Quietly, without ceremony. As they began to wheel him toward a different exit, Hank caught his reflection in the darkened glass. He looked smaller somehow. Older. Not weak, but alone. And for the first time since waking up from surgery, a clear, cold thought cut through the haze of pain and fatigue. This hadn't been a mistake. No one was coming. The transport van smelled faintly of disinfectant and old fabric, a neutral scent meant to offend no one and comfort no one either. Hank was secured into the seat with practiced efficiency. the orderly offering a polite nod before shutting the door. The sound echoed louder than it should have, a hollow thud that seemed to seal him off from the hospital and from whatever expectations he'd carried out with him. The driver pulled away without a word. Middle-aged, baseball cap pulled low, eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't ask Hank how he was feeling. He didn't glance in the rearview mirror. To him, this was just another end-of-shift run, another name on a clipboard. Hank understood that, but understanding didn't soften the sting. The van merged into traffic, tires humming against the road. Streetlights streaked past the windows, long smears of yellow and white blurring together as the city slid by. Hank watched them without really seeing them. His reflection faint in the glass, older, pale, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Each bump in the road sent a fresh reminder through his body, pain sharpening where the hospital bed and medication had kept it dulled. Here, without the quiet dignity of clean sheets and careful hands, it felt raw, less contained. He adjusted slightly, then stopped. Moving only made it worse. Silence filled the space between him and the driver. No radio, no idle talk, just the steady rhythm of driving and the low rattle of the van's interior. Hank had spent most of his life around noise job sites, machinery, shouted instructions, laughter over beers at the end of a long day. This kind of silence was different. It gave his thoughts too much room. They drifted, uninvited, to Ethan. He remembered Ethan at 12, standing awkwardly on a construction site in boots that were too big, trying to look useful. Hank had put a hand on his shoulder and told him just to watch, to learn. He remembered long nights balancing payroll, taking fewer jobs some months just to make sure his workers and his family were taken care of. He remembered signing checks, missing school events, telling himself it would be worth it because he was building something solid, something that would last. All of it had been for stability, for respect, for the idea that when it mattered, he wouldn't be alone. The van stopped at a red light. Hank watched a group of people cross the street, bundled in jackets against the early fall chill. One man laughed, clapping another on the back. They looked unremarkable, ordinary, and yet something in Hank tightened. Those men would go home tonight and not think twice about who would pick them up from a hospital if they needed it. It was assumed, earned simply by being part of someone's life. When had that assumption slipped away from him? He searched his memory for a single moment, an argument, a decision, a line crossed that explained how respect had eroded into inconvenience. Nothing stood out. There was no dramatic break, just a slow thinning, he realized. Calls answered later. Visits shorter. Conversations that skimmed the surface and never went deep. He'd noticed it, of course, but he'd told himself it was normal. People got busy. Lives moved forward. The van turned onto a wider road, picking up speed. Hank's hands rested in his lap, fingers curled slightly, nails biting into his palms. He welcomed the pressure. It grounded him. Beneath the ache and fatigue, something else stirred, an unfamiliar heat, controlled but present. Anger. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that demanded release. This was quieter, heavier. It settled low in his chest, solid and patient. It didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, waiting. The driver finally glanced up, catching Hank's eyes in the mirror for a split second before looking away again. No words were exchanged. The city thinned into quieter streets, houses set back from the road, lights glowing softly behind windows. Somewhere in that stretch of darkness was Hank's home. As the van slowed, turning toward his neighborhood, Hank took a slow breath through his nose. Whatever this was this night, this silence, this realization, it wasn't finished with him yet. And he had a feeling the ride home was only the beginning. The van pulled away as soon as Hank was helped to the front door, its taillights disappearing down the street without hesitation. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the silence of the ride itself. His house sat exactly as he'd left it that morning, modest, familiar, lights off. No sign that anyone had been there ahead of him. No porch light switched on in anticipation. Just a dark outline against the neighboring homes, all of them glowing softly with evening life. Hank unlocked the door slowly, each movement careful, measured. The familiar creak of the hinge greeted him as he stepped inside. The air was stale, untouched. He paused in the entryway, waiting for something: voices, movement, the smell of food. There was nothing. The house didn't feel welcoming. It felt vacant, as if it had been holding its breath all day and now exhaled emptiness around him. He made his way to the kitchen first, leaning lightly on the counter as he walked. The overhead light flicked on, revealing exactly what he hadn't expected and somehow feared. The counters were bare, no covered plates, no note taped to the fridge. The refrigerator held the same half-empty shelves he'd left behind: condiments, an old carton of milk, nothing ready. No one had thought to prepare anything for him. Not soup, not leftovers, not even a bottle of water set out within easy reach. The realization settled slowly, each second adding weight. He hadn't asked for much. He'd never asked for much. But this felt intentional. Hank closed the refrigerator door and stood there longer than necessary, steadying himself as a wave of fatigue washed over him. He checked his phone again out of habit, thumb stiff, movements slower now. Still nothing. No missed calls. No texts. No follow-up. The silence from Ethan and Lena wasn't just an absence anymore. It was a decision. On the kitchen table lay a neatly stacked set of discharge papers and a plastic bag of medication the hospital had sent home with him. Hank carried them to the living room and lowered himself into the armchair near the window. The cushion sagged beneath his weight, familiar but suddenly uncomfortable. He spread the papers across his lap and tried to focus. The list of medications blurred together names he couldn't pronounce, dosages spaced out by hours, warnings printed in dense blocks of text. Take with food, do not miss a dose, call your doctor if... His head throbbed as he read. He tried to organize them in his mind, to create a schedule, but everything felt slippery, out of reach. This was supposed to be the part where someone else helped, where someone double-checked, where someone asked if he understood. Instead, he was alone with it. Exhaustion won out before clarity did. Hank folded the papers back into a pile, set them on the side table, and leaned his head back. He told himself he would just close his eyes for a moment, just until the room stopped spinning. When he woke, it was fully dark outside. The television was off. The house was silent. Pain flared sharply through his abdomen as he shifted, the kind that stole his breath for a moment and left him disoriented. He blinked, trying to remember where he was, why he felt so wrong. Confusion crept in, followed by something colder. This wasn't just neglect, it felt planned. The empty kitchen, the unanswered phone, the timing of everything. As Hank sat there in the darkness, the sense that something had been set in motion quietly, deliberately wrapped around him, and whatever it was, it hadn't ended with being left at the hospital. Hank sat forward in the chair, the stiffness in his body protesting as he reached for his phone again. The room was dim except for the faint glow from the streetlight outside the window, its light cutting across the floor in a pale stripe. He hadn't planned to check his phone anymore. He already knew what it would show. Nothing. But habit, or maybe instinct, pulled it back into his hand. The screen lit up. At first, he saw nothing unusual. No new texts. No missed messages from Ethan or Lena. His chest tightened, that familiar mix of disappointment and resignation settling in again. Then he noticed the small notification icon at the top of the screen. A missed call. Earlier that afternoon. First National Bank. Hank frowned. He didn't miss calls from his bank, not without a voicemail. He tapped the call log, his movements slower now, more careful. The timestamp made his stomach sink. The call had come in while he was still sitting in the wheelchair near the hospital exit, while he was waiting, while he was telling himself everything was fine. Before he could process that, another notification slid into view. Email. Account access changed. The words didn't make sense at first. He stared at them, reading them again, then again, as if the meaning might soften with repetition. Account access changed. That was the kind of message you got when you requested it, when you reset a password. When you authorized something, Hank hadn't done any of that. A tightness crept into his chest, sharper than the pain from surgery. He opened the email with a shaky thumb. The message was brief, almost casual in tone, thanking him for updating his account permissions and advising him to contact the bank if the change was unauthorized. Unauthorized. His mouth went dry. Hank immediately opened the banking app, fingers suddenly clumsy, betraying the calm he was trying to maintain. He entered his password once. The screen refreshed. Incorrect login. He tried again, slower this time, certain he'd mistyped. Same result. A small red warning appeared beneath the password field. Too many failed attempts may result in a temporary lock. His heart began to pound, each beat loud in his ears. He forced himself to breathe and tapped the Forgot Password option. The app loaded for a moment, then froze. When it refreshed, a new message appeared. This account is temporarily unavailable. Please contact customer support. Hank lowered the phone slightly, staring at the screen as if it had betrayed him. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker. His thoughts raced ahead of him, jumping to conclusions he didn't want to name. This wasn't a glitch. It didn't feel random. The timing was too precise, too clean. He scrolled back to the email, reading it more carefully this time. There it was, buried in the fine print confirmation of a change authorized earlier that day. A specific time, a window that made his stomach twist. Earlier that day, he had been under anesthesia. His hand tightened around the phone. Pain flared briefly where the incision pulled, but he barely noticed. One name pushed its way to the front of his mind, uninvited but unavoidable. Ethan. Hank didn't hesitate this time. He pressed call, lifting the phone to his ear, listening as it rang. Once, twice, 4 times. Voicemail. He hung up and tried again immediately, pulse hammering now, each unanswered ring feeding the unease spreading through him. Voicemail again. No decline, no interruption, just absence. Pick up, Hank muttered, his voice hoarse. Just pick up. He tried Lena next. Straight to voicemail. The room felt suddenly unfamiliar, like he was sitting in someone else's house. His own furniture seemed distant, unreal. The chair beneath him no longer felt like support. It felt like a trap, holding him in place while something moved around him unseen. This wasn't about being forgotten at the hospital. This wasn't about inconvenience or neglect. The missed call from the bank, the locked account, the email sent while he was unconscious. Pieces were lining up, and the picture they formed was darker than anything he'd allowed himself to consider. The hurt he'd been carrying all evening, the quiet humiliation, the disappointment drained away, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. Fear. And as Hank stared at his phone, waiting for a call that didn't come, he understood one thing with chilling clarity. Whatever was happening, it was already in motion. Hank didn't sleep after that. He sat in the chair until the pain in his back and abdomen forced him to shift, then stood slowly, gripping the armrest until the room stopped tilting. Fear had a way of sharpening focus. It cut through fatigue, through medication haze, through the instinct to wait until morning. Whatever had been done to his accounts hadn't waited. Neither would he. He moved to the kitchen, phone in hand, and sat at the table beneath the dim overhead light. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. He dialed the number on the back of his debit card, pressing each digit carefully, deliberately. The automated system felt surreal, cheerful, detached as it routed his call. When a real voice finally came on the line, Hank felt a brief, irrational relief. After confirming his identity, name, address, answers to questions he'd known for decades, the woman on the other end paused. Her tone shifted slightly, becoming more formal. "Mr. Miller," she said, "your account activity today reflects changes made under an active power of attorney." Hank closed his eyes for a moment. "Active?" he repeated. "That shouldn't be possible." There was a soft clicking sound, keys tapping. "According to our records, the power of attorney was filed earlier today and verified." "Earlier today," Hank said slowly. "What time?" She gave him the timestamp. It was during his surgery. His hand tightened around the phone. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold wave washing over him. "And who filed it?" he asked, though the answer was already forming in his mind. "I can't disclose personal details beyond what's authorized," she replied, careful now. "But the document appears valid. The signature matches the one we have on file." "Matches," Hank echoed. "Or resembles." Another pause, longer this time. "It's close," she admitted. "Sufficient for processing. Sufficient." The word landed like a verdict. He thanked her and ended the call, setting the phone down gently, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little control he had left. His reflections stared back at him from the darkened window. Eyes wide, jaw clenched, a man trying to hold himself together while something fundamental shifted beneath his feet. Power of attorney. He hadn't thought about those papers in months. Maybe longer. Ethan had brought them up casually one evening, framed as precaution. "Just in case," he'd said. Lena had nodded along, chiming in smoothly about emergencies, about paperwork being easier if things were already in place. Hank remembered hesitating, asking questions. He'd never signed anything final. Or at least, he hadn't thought he had. But now the bank said otherwise. Hank picked up his phone again, scrolling until he found the hospital number. His thumb hovered for a second before pressing call. It rang twice before someone answered. "Nurse's station," a familiar voice said. "Carla," Hank said, recognizing it instantly. "This is Hank Miller. I was discharged earlier today." There was a brief pause. Then warmth crept into her tone. "Mr. Miller, how are you feeling?" He almost laughed at that. "I need to ask you something," he said instead. "What time did I go into surgery?" She answered without hesitation. "And how long was I under?" Another answer. Precise. Clinical. Hank did the math in his head, even though he already knew. The timestamp from the bank slid neatly into that window, fitting too well to be coincidence. "Carla," he said quietly, "did anyone come by asking questions about me while I was under? Any paperwork? Any calls?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had changed. "There was a call," she said carefully. "Administration routed it. They were asking about your condition, about whether you were able to make decisions." Hank closed his eyes. "They said they were family," she continued. "They were very specific about timing." That was it, the last piece settling into place. Hank thanked her and ended the call. The kitchen felt colder now, the light harsher. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a sequence. Planned, timed, executed while he lay unconscious, trusting the people who were supposed to protect him. The hurt he'd felt, the abandonment, the quiet shame of being left behind finally sharpened into something clear enough to name: betrayal. And as Hank sat alone at the table, staring at the blank wall ahead of him, he understood something else just as clearly. They hadn't just taken advantage of his absence. They had assumed he wouldn't notice. Hank moved through the house with slow purpose, the way he used to walk job sites when something didn't add up. Not rushed, not panicked, just methodical. The kitchen light went dark behind him as he made his way down the hallway toward the small office he rarely used anymore. Each step sent a dull reminder through his body, but he welcomed it. Pain kept him present. The office smelled faintly of dust and old paper. He flicked on the desk lamp, its yellow glow cutting a tight circle of light across the cluttered surface. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their metal drawers scarred from decades of use. Hank lowered himself into the chair with care, then reached for the bottom drawer, the one he hadn't opened in months. It stuck for a moment before sliding free. Inside were folders, thick and thin, labeled in his own handwriting. Insurance, property, business, estate, his life, reduced to paper and ink. He pulled them out one by one, stacking them on the desk, his movements slower now but steady. The weight of the files felt heavier than it should have, as if they carried more than just documents. Halfway through the stack, he found it. A plain manila folder, edges worn soft. He recognized it immediately. The sight of it sent a tight pulse through his chest. He opened it and spread the contents across the desk, his eyes scanning the pages despite already knowing what they would say. Power of attorney, medical directives, financial authorization. Ethan's idea. Hank remembered the conversation clearly now, sharper than it had been before. It had been a Sunday afternoon. Ethan sitting across from him at this very desk, casual, almost bored. "It's just in case something happens," he'd said. "You know, emergencies. Makes things easier." Hank had frowned then, uneasy. He'd asked why it was necessary. He wasn't sick. He wasn't incompetent. He'd built a company from nothing. He knew how to manage his affairs. Lena had been there too, leaning in the doorway, arms crossed but voice smooth. "It's not about now," she'd said. "It's about not leaving things messy later. You don't want us scrambling if something goes wrong." Hank remembered hesitating, pen in hand, the paper untouched. He'd said he wanted time to think, that he didn't like rushing legal matters. Ethan had sighed, impatient. Lena had smiled, reassuring. They'd left the folder behind, saying he could look it over whenever he wanted. He had, or at least, he thought he had. Now, under the harsh light of the lamp, Hank examined the signatures closely. His name was there, inked in a familiar slant, but something about it was off. The pressure inconsistent, the curve of the letters slightly wrong. It looked like his signature drawn from memory rather than written by hand. A copy. His jaw tightened. He flipped through the remaining pages, finding initials in places he didn't remember initialing, dates he didn't remember filling in. Each page added another layer to the picture forming in his mind. This hadn't been a single impulsive act. It had been prepared, set up months in advance. All it needed was the right moment. And they'd chosen it well. The night at the hospital, the unanswered calls, the sudden urgency to be busy. It all slid into place with sickening clarity. While he lay unconscious on an operating table, someone else had stepped neatly into his place. Hank leaned back in the chair, a slow, controlled breath leaving his lungs. Rage surged up, hot and immediate, but he didn't let it spill over. He learned long ago that uncontrolled anger made mistakes. This wasn't the time for that. This was the time for understanding exactly what had been taken and how. He gathered the documents into a neat stack and closed the folder, his hands steady despite the fire burning beneath his skin. They had assumed his hesitation was weakness, that his trust was carelessness. That age had dulled his attention. They were wrong. And as Hank sat there in the quiet office, the first clear thought of what came next began to take shape, cold, deliberate, and impossible to undo. Hank waited until morning, not because he needed rest, sleep had barely touched him, but because daylight changed how people spoke. It made lies easier to hide, impatience harder to mask. He showered carefully, each movement deliberate, then dressed in clean clothes that made him look smaller than he felt. He let his shoulders slump, let the stiffness show. When he caught his reflection, he adjusted his expression until the sharpness in his eyes dulled. Weakness, he knew, was a language. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone in front of him for a long moment before calling Ethan. When he finally pressed the button, his hand was steady. His voice, when the line connected, was not. "Hey," Hank said softly, after Ethan picked up on the third ring. "It's me." There was noise on the other end, traffic, maybe an office. Ethan exhaled audibly, like the call was an interruption. "Yeah, Dad. What's going on?" Hank swallowed, letting a pause stretch just long enough to sound uncertain. I'm a little confused," he said. "About some things. The bank, my accounts. I can't seem to get into anything." Another sigh. Shorter this time. Tighter. "I thought we talked about that," Ethan said. "I'm handling the finances now, remember?" The words landed cleanly, confidently. Too confidently. Hank closed his eyes as if gathering himself. "Handling them?" he repeated. "I don't remember agreeing to that." "Well, you did," Ethan replied quickly. "You weren't in great shape, Dad. We didn't want you worrying about it. It's better this way." Better this way. Hank let the phrase sit between them, heavy and unchallenged. He imagined Ethan pacing somewhere, phone tucked against his ear, already irritated that this conversation wasn't going as smoothly as he'd expected. "I just don't understand what's happening," Hank said. "There were emails, and I couldn't log in. I thought maybe something was wrong." "It's not wrong," Ethan said, a sharp edge creeping into his voice. "It's taken care of." Silence followed. Hank said nothing. He let the quiet do the work for him. Ethan filled it. "We've had to make some decisions," he continued, the words coming faster now. "You know, practical stuff, moving things around, preparing." "Preparing for what?" Hank asked gently. Another pause. Too long. When Ethan spoke again, his tone had shifted just slightly. "For the future," he said. "For contingencies." Hank nodded, even though Ethan couldn't see it. "I see," he murmured. "So everything's moving?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "I mean, no, not everything. Just some things." There it was. Hank felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained even. "Like what?" Ethan hesitated, then answered too quickly. "It's nothing you need to worry about. Just paperwork. There was an opportunity to sell something, and it made sense to act fast." Sell something. Hank's grip tightened around the phone. He pictured the company's shares, the properties, the accounts he'd spent a lifetime building. He forced himself to breathe slowly, quietly, keeping his tone light. "Oh," he said, "I didn't realize anything was being sold." "It's not a big deal," Ethan said, irritation flaring now. "Look, Dad, you're recovering. You should be resting, not stressing yourself out over details." Details. Hank let his shoulders sag further, let a note of defeat creep into his voice. "You're right," he said. "I'm probably just tired. Everything feels harder than it should." "Exactly," Ethan replied, relief slipping into his tone. "That's why this is better. Trust me. I've got it under control. Trust me." Hank stayed silent again. On the other end, Ethan took that silence as agreement. "I've got to get back to a meeting," Ethan said. "We'll talk later, okay?" "Okay," Hank said softly. The call ended. Hank set the phone down on the table and stared at it for a long moment. The house was quiet. Sunlight crept across the floor, warm and indifferent. Inside his chest, something solidified. Ethan hadn't asked how he was feeling. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't even pretended this was temporary. He'd spoken like a man already standing on the other side of the door, convinced it was locked behind him. Hank leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing just slightly. They thought he was confused. They thought he was tired. They thought he was beaten. And because of that, they'd just told him more than they ever intended. The trap, once only an idea, now had a shape, and it had begun to close. Hank waited until the afternoon, when the pain medication dulled the sharpest edges without clouding his thoughts. He sat at the desk in his office again, the same manila folder resting in front of him like a quiet accusation. For the first time since the surgery, he didn't feel rushed. The call he was about to make mattered, and he wanted his voice steady when he made it. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he hadn't tapped in years. Mark Dalton. They'd built something together once. Long days, longer nights, arguments that ended in handshakes instead of grudges. When Hank had stepped back from day-to-day operations, Mark had stayed on, running the company with a level head and a memory like a ledger. If anyone would notice something off, it would be him. The phone rang twice before Mark answered. "Hank?" he said, surprise and genuine warmth in his voice. "It's been a while." "It has," Hank replied. "I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important." That got Mark's attention. "What's going on?" Hank didn't dramatize it. He didn't vent. He laid out the facts the way he'd learned to on job sites and in boardrooms. Clean, chronological, unemotional. Surgery, hospital, power of attorney activated, accounts locked. His voice didn't waver. Even when he reached the part about Ethan, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Give me a minute," Mark said finally. "Don't hang up." Hank listened to muffled movement, the faint clatter of a keyboard. He imagined Mark's office windows overlooking the yard, blueprints rolled against the wall, the old framed photo of the two of them breaking ground on their first major project. Time passed differently when you were waiting for confirmation of something you already feared. Mark came back on the line. His tone changed. Sharper, focused. "Hank," he said, "there have been transfers." Hank closed his eyes. "What kind?" "Your shares," Mark replied. "A portion of them were moved last week, quietly. Paperwork came through fast, but it was clean enough to slide under the radar unless you were looking for it." "I wasn't," Hank said, "because I never authorized a sale." "I know," Mark said. "That's why this didn't sit right with me. The signatures were off, close, but not you." The confirmation landed heavy, but it also brought something unexpected with it. Relief. Not because the situation was better, but because it was real. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't losing his grip. "How much?" Hank asked. "Enough to matter," Mark said. "Not enough to raise alarms yet. Whoever did this was being careful. Careful. Calculated." Hank exhaled slowly. "I didn't give permission," he said. "Not verbally, not in writing." "I believe you," Mark said without hesitation. There was no doubt in his voice, no need for proof. Just certainty built on years of knowing the man on the other end of the line. "Good," Hank replied. "Because I'm going to need help." Mark didn't ask with what. He didn't warn him to slow down or suggest letting it go. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I'll pull everything. Dates, documents, trails. If someone's moving pieces without you, we'll see it." For the first time since waking up in the hospital, Hank felt the weight on his chest ease, just slightly. He leaned back in his chair, the pain still there but no longer consuming. "Thank you," he said quietly. Mark gave a short, humorless laugh. "You didn't build that company so someone else could steal it while you were on an operating table," he said. "You're not doing this alone." The call ended, and Hank sat in the quiet office, the late afternoon light slanting across the desk. The betrayal still burned. The anger was still there, controlled, but alive. But now, so was something else. Support. Someone else knew. Someone else was watching. And whoever had assumed Hank would stay silent had just lost the advantage. Hank didn't rush the meeting. He shaved carefully, dressed neatly, and drove himself despite the discomfort. wanting to feel every mile between his house and the downtown office building where Susan Blake practiced. The city looked different through the windshield, now less familiar, more exposed, like a place where things happened whether you were ready or not. Susan's office was quiet in the way. Only serious places were. Clean lines, no clutter. Degrees framed without flair. She greeted Hank with a firm handshake and an assessing look that missed nothing. There was no pity in her eyes, only attention. They sat across from each other at a polished table as Hank laid everything out. The bank emails, the locked accounts, the power of attorney documents, the timing of the surgery, Mark's confirmation about the shares. He spoke evenly, keeping emotion out of it, the way he'd learned to when stakes were high. Susan listened without interrupting, occasionally making a note, occasionally asking him to slide a document closer. When he finished, she leaned back slightly and adjusted her glasses. "Let's go through this carefully," she said. She examined each page with methodical precision, comparing signatures, dates, initials. She cross-referenced timestamps with the medical records Hank had brought, pausing when she reached the surgery window. Her finger tapped once against the paper. "This," she said, "is where it falls apart for them." Hank looked up. "How so?" "You were legally incapacitated during this period," she replied. "Under anesthesia, any document executed during that window, especially one transferring financial control, is immediately suspect." She slid the papers back toward him. "The power of attorney may look valid on its face, but the timing undermines it completely." A tight knot in Hank's chest loosened slightly. "So it can be challenged." "It can be overturned," Susan corrected calmly. "And not quietly, if you don't want it to be." She continued, outlining it step by step. The activation while he was unconscious. The suspicious similarity but not identity of the signature. The rapid financial movements that followed. The lack of direct confirmation from Hank himself. "Taken together," she said, "this suggests intent, not confusion, not an emergency decision made in good faith. This looks like exploitation." The word hung in the air between them. Hank stared at the documents, seeing them differently now, not as evidence of loss, but as leverage. "What happens next?" he asked. Susan folded her hands. "If you want to move fast, we can. Emergency filings, account freezes, a formal challenge to the power of attorney. We could initiate proceedings that would put your son and daughter-in-law on the defensive immediately." "And the company?" Hank asked. "We can halt further transfers," she said. "Reverse what's been done. Pending investigation. Given what you've shown me, your position is strong. Very strong. Strong enough to destroy them fast." Hank understood that without her saying it. Court filings, public records, consequences that wouldn't stay contained within the family, careers questioned, reputations cracked. The satisfaction of swift justice flared briefly, tempting and bright. Susan watched his face carefully. "But," she added, "speed isn't always strategy. If there's more happening behind the scenes, and I suspect there is, moving too quickly, might stop them before they reveal everything." Hank leaned back in his chair, feeling the truth of that settle in. Ethan's careless words, Lena's calculated calm, the partial transfers, the restraint they'd shown so far. "They think I'm confused," Hank said quietly. Susan nodded. "Then they're underestimating you." Silence stretched as Hank considered the options laid out in front of him. He could end this now, slam the door shut before they realized how exposed they were. Or he could wait, watch, let them move a little more, talk a little more, hang themselves with their own certainty. He looked up at Susan. "I don't want to stop them yet." Her expression didn't change, but something like approval flickered in her eyes. "Patience," she said. "That's a dangerous thing in the right hands." "I want everything documented," Hank continued. "Every move, every transfer, every assumption they make." Susan nodded once. "Then we proceed quietly, we prepare, and when you decide to act, it will be decisive." Hank stood slowly, the pain in his body, still there but secondary now. As he gathered the documents, he felt something settle into place, control, returning not with force, but with clarity. He had the law on his side. He had evidence. He had time. And as he left Susan Blake's office, Hank understood the most important thing of all. They believed the damage was already done. They had no idea how much room he was giving them to make it worse. Hank became careful about how he sounded. Not stronger, not sharper, smaller. When Ethan called, Hank let it ring once or twice before answering, as if he'd struggled to reach the phone. His voice stayed thin, uncertain, threaded with pauses that suggested confusion rather than calculation. "Sorry," he'd say. "I forgot what day it was." Ethan corrected him every time, impatience barely hidden. Hank apologized every time, quietly, like a man embarrassed by his own decline. He asked the same questions twice, sometimes 3 times, about passwords, about meetings, about things Ethan had already explained. Each repetition irritated his son just a little more. Hank could hear it in the tightening of Ethan's voice, the way he rushed answers now. Control was settling in, and with it, carelessness. He missed appointments on purpose. A follow-up with the bank. A call Susan had warned him not to skip, but Hank did, then acted surprised when someone mentioned it later. "Did I?" he'd ask. "I must have written it down wrong." Lena took over quickly. She started calling instead of Ethan, her tones smooth, reassuring, edged with something sharper underneath. "You don't need to worry about those things anymore, Hank," she said more than once. "We're handling it." "We." That word told him everything. Her confidence grew with each passing day. She stopped pretending this was temporary. She spoke about plans, about restructuring, about simplifying Hank's life, as if it were already settled. She mentioned paperwork she'd taken care of, decisions she'd already made. Hank listened. He nodded when they were in person. Over the phone, he let silences stretch until Lena filled them herself. Assets continued moving. Mark kept him informed quietly, efficiently. Small transfers, shares shifting hands, accounts consolidated. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to prove momentum. Susan documented everything. Timestamps aligned neatly with call logs and emails. Every move made the paper trail stronger. Hank didn't intervene. Not yet. Instead, he leaned into the role they'd written for him. He let his shoulders round, let his speech slow. He asked Ethan to repeat himself, even when he understood perfectly. When Ethan explained something financial, Hank thanked him with relief instead of skepticism. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said once. The line landed exactly as intended. Ethan relaxed after that. He started speaking more freely, less guarded. He complained about stress, about responsibility, about how hard it was to manage everything alone. Hank listened like a burden, not a threat. Lena, meanwhile, stopped hiding her satisfaction. She corrected him openly now, finished his sentences, took calls in the same room without lowering her voice. Hank noticed how often she said ours instead of yours. How she spoke about the house, the company, the accounts like they'd already changed hands. Once, she reminded him to take his medication, her tone brisk, almost clinical. Hank thanked her and let his hand tremble just enough as he picked up the pill bottle. That night, alone, he sat in his office and reviewed the notes Susan had prepared. Dates, amounts, names. Everything aligned perfectly. Every assumption they made became evidence. Every shortcut they took tightened the structure forming around them. The rope. Hank could feel it drawing closed, inch by inch. There were moments, quiet ones, when grief crept in. Not loud, not dramatic, just a dull awareness that this was his son. That trust, once broken, didn't mend cleanly. That whatever came next would leave something permanently altered. He let himself feel that, briefly. Then he set it aside. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about clarity. Ethan believed he was in control. Lena believed the hard part was over. They spoke like winners, moved like winners, planned like nothing could touch them. They had no idea how closely they were being watched. Hank closed his notebook and turned off the desk lamp, the room falling into shadow around him. Somewhere across town, decisions were being made in his name. Assets shifted. Lines were crossed. He didn't stop it. He waited. Because the more confident they became, the more certain Hank was of one thing: they were pulling the rope tighter themselves. The invitation came 2 days later. Lena's voice was warm on the phone, almost cheerful. "We thought it would be nice to have you over for dinner," she said. "You've been through a lot. You shouldn't be alone." Hank thanked her and agreed, his tone mild, grateful even. When he hung up, he sat for a long moment staring at the blank wall in front of him. He already knew what the evening would bring. The invitation wasn't about comfort. It was about confirmation. Ethan opened the door when Hank arrived, his smile quick and rehearsed. "Hey, Dad," he said, stepping aside. "Come in. How are you feeling?" "Still a little sore," Hank replied, letting his voice falter just enough. "But I'll be all right." Lena appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel as if she'd been busy cooking all afternoon. She embraced him lightly, careful not to linger. "You look tired," she said. "You should be taking it easy." The house was immaculate, too immaculate. Everything in its place. Surfaces cleared, no trace of the clutter that comes with real living. Hank took a seat at the table, noticing how the chair had been positioned at the end, slightly apart. A small thing, not accidental. Dinner passed with practiced normalcy. They asked about his recovery, nodded at his answers, offered sympathetic murmurs at the right moments. Ethan spoke mostly about work, about stress, about responsibility. Lena steered the conversation when it drifted too close to anything real. Halfway through the meal, Lena leaned back slightly, folding her hands together. "We've been thinking," she said, her tone careful, "about what makes the most sense for you going forward." Hank looked up, attentive but silent. "You've got a lot of space you don't really use anymore," she continued. "And maintenance can be exhausting, especially while you're recovering. Downsizing could be a relief." Ethan nodded, eager. "It's just practical, Dad. Less to worry about." Hank chewed slowly, giving himself time. "I suppose," he said. "I hadn't thought much about it." "That's understandable," Lena said smoothly. "That's why we're here." The words settled heavily. "We're here." Hank watched them carefully now. The way they leaned in when they spoke, the shared glances that passed between them. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a direction. "And of course," Lena added, as if it were an afterthought, "there are some excellent care facilities nearby. Short-term at least, just until you're fully back on your feet. Care facilities." The phrase hung in the air, clean and clinical. Hank felt a flicker of something sharp in his chest, not surprise, but confirmation. This was the endpoint, the logical conclusion of every step they'd taken so far. Ethan cleared his throat. "It would take a lot of pressure off you," he said. "Off all of us." Hank met his son's eyes. He saw no malice there, only relief. The relief of someone who believed the hardest choices had already been made for him. He nodded slowly. "If that's what you think is best," he said. Lena smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. "I'm glad you understand." They finished dinner with lighter conversation, as if something had been resolved. Lena talked about logistics. Ethan joked half-heartedly. Hank listened, storing every word, every assumption. When it was time to leave, Lena hugged him again, firmer this time. "We'll take care of everything," she said softly. "I know," Hank replied. The drive home was quiet. The streetlights passed in steady rhythm, and Hank's reflection in the windshield looked older, smaller, exactly as they believed him to be. But inside, the last doubt fell away. They weren't managing his recovery. They were planning his removal. And as Hank pulled into his driveway, the decision he'd been circling for days finally locked into place. He wouldn't stop this. He would let them finish. The shift happened quietly. No raised voices, no warnings, no dramatic confrontations. Susan filed the injunction just after close of business, when offices emptied and assumptions settled in. It was precise, narrow, and devastating. Emergency relief based on medical incapacity, fraudulent activation of power, of attorney, and imminent financial harm. Every claim backed by timestamps, signatures, and documented transfers. By the time the courthouse lights went dark, the machinery was already moving. Hank didn't sleep much that night. Not from anxiety he'd passed that stage, but from awareness. He lay in bed listening to the house settle, the faint creaks and distant sounds grounding him. Somewhere across the city, systems were updating, permissions were being revoked, doors were closing. By morning, it was done. Hank's phone buzzed just after 7. A secure message from the bank confirmed what Susan had promised. Accounts temporarily frozen pending investigation. All recent authorization changes suspended. The language was formal, neutral, but Hank felt the weight of it immediately. Control had snapped back into place, not loudly, but completely. A second notification followed. The pending property sale had been halted, title transfer blocked, escrow suspended. No explanation sent to the buyers yet, just a wall where momentum had been. Hank set the phone down and breathed out slowly. Across town, Mark was already at work. He didn't call Ethan. He didn't warn him. He simply acted. As managing partner, Mark had the authority to intervene once Susan's filings cleared. He notified the board, flagged the irregular transfers, and initiated a review. Shares that had been quietly moved were reverted just as quietly. Access credentials were reset. Ethan's professional reach shrank in real time. When Ethan tried to log in that morning, nothing worked. By mid-morning, Hank's phone rang. He didn't answer. The paper trail was now undeniable. Every transfer lined up with Hank's surgery window. Every authorization traced back to the same narrow window of opportunity. The signatures, once passable at a glance, collapsed under scrutiny. Too consistent, too careful. The kind of forgery done by someone who'd watched closely but never practiced enough. Susan called just before noon. "Everything's in place," she said. "They can't move anything else. Not money, not property, not shares." "And the damage?" Hank asked. "Contained," she replied, "but visible. Anyone who looks will see it." Hank thanked her and ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table, sunlight warming the wood beneath his hands. The same table where he'd pretended confusion, where he'd let his voice tremble, where he'd been spoken to like a liability. Now, silence worked differently. The second call came an hour later. Ethan's name lit up the screen again. Hank watched it ring, imagining the other side confusion giving way to panic curdling into fear. He let it go to voicemail. A text followed immediately. "Ethan, Dad, something's wrong. The accounts are frozen. Did you do something?" No greeting, no concern, just urgency. Hank didn't respond. Another message came through, this one longer. Explanations, half-formed excuses, mentions of temporary issues, and misunderstandings. Hank read it once, then placed the phone face down. Across town, Lena was learning the same lesson in a different way. Calls unanswered, emails bounced, real estate agents suddenly unavailable. The confident language she'd relied on stopped working when systems stopped responding. Momentum, once broken, doesn't return quietly. Mark called in the afternoon. "Ethan tried to push through a request," he said. "Claimed authority. It didn't land." "Good," Hank replied. "He knows something's wrong," Mark added. "But he doesn't know how much." Hank looked out the window at his yard, unchanged, waiting. He will. By evening, the shock had fully arrived. What Ethan and Lena had believed was theirs already managed, already decided, had vanished overnight. Not taken, reclaimed. The structure they'd built their confidence on collapsed without noise, leaving them exposed and scrambling. Hank stood slowly and turned off the kitchen light. His body still hurt. His recovery wasn't finished, but something else had healed enough to stand on its own. Control had returned, and the people who thought they were finished with him were about to learn how final that assumption had been. The phone buzzed again in the dark. This time, Hank picked it up, but he didn't answer yet. The call came just after midnight. Hank was sitting in the darkened living room, a glass of water untouched on the table beside him, when his phone began to vibrate against the wood. He didn't look at it right away. He already knew who it would be. He let it ring until the sound filled the room, until the urgency on the other end had time to sharpen into something raw. Finally, he answered. "Hank, Dad, please." Ethan's voice cracked through the speaker, breathless, unsteady. Panic stripped it of the confidence Hank had heard so easily before. "Something's wrong. Everything's frozen. The bank, the company, none of it's working." Before Hank could respond, another voice cut in, shrill and uncontrolled. "This is insane!" Lena shouted, her words distorted by distance but unmistakable. "They can't do this. They can't just lock us out. Tell him to fix it." Hank held the phone slightly away from his ear, his expression unreadable. He said nothing. "Dad?" Ethan pressed, desperation leaking into every syllable now. "I don't understand what's happening. We were just trying to help you. This is blowing up." Lena's voice rose again, sharper, angrier. "You need to call your lawyer right now," she snapped, clearly not realizing Hank could hear her. "This is going to ruin everything." Hank listened. He listened to the fear he hadn't heard before, to the chaos where control used to be, to the sound of a structure collapsing under its own weight. He said nothing. "Dad, please," Ethan said again, quieter now. "Just say something." Hank waited a beat longer. Then he ended the call. The silence that followed felt different from the silence of the hospital. or the empty house, or the long nights of waiting. This silence was full. It carried weight. It belonged to him. Within hours, the machinery Susan had warned them about roared fully to life. Formal notices were served. Banks escalated internal reviews. Compliance departments flagged accounts. What had begun as a quiet injunction became an active investigation, its scope widening with every document uncovered. Susan called in the morning. "They've retained counsel," she said calmly. "Aggressive, but reactive. They're trying to explain decisions that no longer make sense." "And the power of attorney?" Hank asked. "Suspended pending review," she replied. "Given the evidence, it won't survive." Mark followed up shortly after. His tone was grim, satisfied in a way he didn't try to hide. "Ethan's name is already circulating," he said. "Compliance flagged the transfers. The board wants answers." Hank closed his eyes briefly. "What does that mean for his job?" Mark exhaled. "At best, he's sidelined. At worst, terminated. Corporate doesn't like anything that smells like fraud." By midday, Ethan stopped calling. Emails replaced calls. Long ones, carefully worded. Apologies wrapped in explanations. Responsibility blurred and redistributed, blame shifted subtly away from intent and toward misunderstanding. Lena's name appeared less frequently as the hours passed. Lawyers now spoke for them. Hank didn't respond to any of it directly. He didn't need to. Susan handled communication with surgical precision. Allowing nothing through that didn't serve a larger purpose. Each exchange tightened the record. Each denial exposed another contradiction. The investigation expanded quietly but relentlessly. Financial auditors traced movement. Legal teams reconstructed timelines. The surgery window, once a narrow opportunity, now glowed like a beacon, impossible to ignore. By evening, the reality settled in. Ethan and Lena were no longer managing anything. They were reacting. Hank sat alone at the kitchen table as the sun dipped low, the same place where he'd once pretended confusion. His body was still healing, still fragile in ways he couldn't ignore. But the balance in the room had shifted. The air itself felt different, steadier. He thought of the man who'd waited in a wheelchair by the hospital doors, phone in hand, believing help was on the way. That man felt distant now. Across town, doors were closing for Ethan boardrooms, offices, systems he'd assumed were his by right. Conversations were happening without him. Decisions were being made that he couldn't influence. The power hadn't just returned to Hank. It had inverted. And as the night settled in, Hank understood with absolute clarity that whatever relationship he'd once had with his son was now standing on unfamiliar ground, one where authority finally was no longer in question. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced in fragments, documents Susan flagged, messages Mark forwarded, timelines reconstructed with clinical precision. Hank sat in Susan Blake's office again, the same polished table between them. But the atmosphere had changed. This time, Susan didn't ease into it. "They didn't act together," she said, sliding a folder across to him. "Not at first." Hank opened it slowly. Inside were emails, notes, drafts of plans that had never been meant for him to see. Lena's language was unmistakable, measured, strategic, relentlessly practical. She had raised concerns months ago about Hank's age, his independence, the risk he posed to long-term stability. She'd framed it carefully, presenting herself as the responsible one, the realist. Susan pointed to a highlighted section. She initiated the power of attorney discussion, she said. She researched timing, medical vulnerability, even consulted a third party about recovery decline probabilities after surgery. Hank read the lines again, his expression unchanged. "And Ethan?" he asked. Susan sighed softly. Ethan hesitated, repeatedly. He pushed back on the timeline. "Worried you'd recover faster than expected." Hank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "But," Susan continued, "he also believed her when she told him you wouldn't bounce back, that you'd lose capacity, that if they didn't act quickly, everything you'd built would be tied up in drawn-out decisions." She met Hank's eyes. He was afraid of you staying strong and of her leaving if he didn't prove he could take control. Fear. The word fit more cleanly than Hank wanted it to. "They expected you to decline fast," Susan added. "The care facility discussions weren't hypothetical. They'd already contacted 2 places. One had availability lined up for you within weeks. Hank closed the folder. Care home. Weeks. The image rose uninvited, his house sold, his company stripped down, his decisions filtered through people who spoke for him instead of with him. Not out of cruelty, Susan had said. Out of convenience. Hank stood. I want to see Ethan. Susan didn't argue. I'll arrange it, she said. Privately. They met in a quiet conference room 2 days later. Neutral ground. No Lena. No lawyers at the table just nearby. Waiting. Ethan looked smaller than Hank remembered. Not physically. In posture, his shoulders slumped. Hands clasped too tightly in his lap. He didn't meet Hank's eyes at first. Dad, Ethan said finally, his voice strained. I didn't know how to stop it once it started. Hank sat across from him, steady, silent. She kept saying it was temporary. Ethan rushed on. That you'd thank us later. That this was the only way to keep things from falling apart. And you believed her? Hank said calmly. Ethan nodded, eyes wet now. I thought you were done fighting. I thought I was stepping up. Hank watched him closely. This wasn't the man who'd spoken confidently about selling assets. This was someone cornered by his own choices. When did you decide I didn't deserve a say? Hank asked. Ethan's breath hitched. I didn't think. That's not an answer, Hank said, not raising his voice. The silence broke Ethan. I was scared, he said, the words tumbling out. Of failing, of losing everything, of her leaving if I didn't prove I could handle it. I thought if you went into a facility, things would stabilize. Stabilize. Hank nodded slowly, absorbing it without reaction. No anger surged, no grief spilled over. Just a clean, unmistakable understanding. You were willing to put me away, Hank said, to make your life easier. Ethan covered his face, shoulders shaking. I didn't think you'd notice, he whispered. I didn't think you'd come back like this. That, Hank realized, was the core of it. They had planned around his absence, his weakness, his disappearance from relevance. They had not planned for his return. Hank stood, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. Ethan looked up at him, desperate now, searching for something, for forgiveness, for absolution, for a way out. Hank felt none of it. No rage, no satisfaction, no sorrow. Only clarity. I built my life on responsibility, Hank said evenly. You treated it like an inconvenience. He turned toward the door. Dad, Ethan began. Hank paused but didn't look back. This isn't about punishment, he said. It's about reality. He left Ethan sitting alone, the truth finally stripped of excuses. And as Hank walked down the hallway, pain flaring briefly with each step, he understood something with quiet certainty. Whatever came next wouldn't be driven by emotion. It would be final. The consequences unfolded without spectacle. There were no courtroom scenes, no public statements, no names dragged through headlines. Susan handled it the way she handled everything else, quietly, efficiently, without leaving room for drama. The charges were negotiated behind closed doors, framed carefully to avoid criminal proceedings while still acknowledging wrongdoing. Civil exposure, restitution, and binding agreements replaced handcuffs and press conferences. It was mercy of a particular kind, the kind that still cost everything. Assets began returning in measured steps. Accounts unlocked, balances restored. Properties reverted cleanly, their titles scrubbed of the brief contamination. Corporate shares slid back into Hank's name as if they had never left, though the paper trail ensured the attempt would never be forgotten. What had been taken under false authority was now undeniably his again. Hank watched it happen from a distance, reviewing summaries instead of statements, trusting Susan and Mark to manage the mechanics. Control, once reclaimed, no longer required his constant attention. It simply existed, solid and unquestioned. One afternoon, Susan placed a single document in front of him. Your will, she said. Updated. Hank read it slowly. The revisions were clean, unemotional. Ethan's name appeared once only in reference to removal. No dramatics, no explanation. Just absence where entitlement had once been assumed. Is this what you want? Susan asked. Hank nodded. It should have been done sooner. They restructured the trust the same way. Independent oversight, clear succession, no single point of leverage. The kind of structure Hank had once believed unnecessary because he trusted the people closest to him. That trust was gone now. replaced by something sturdier. Lena's consequences were less contained. Civil liability followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent inducement, coordinated exploitation. Each claim supported by her own words, preserved in emails and notes she'd assumed would never surface. Settlements drained resources. Professional relationships cooled. Invitations stopped arriving. She fought harder than Ethan had denial, sharpened by anger, but the record was unkind to her. Strategy only worked when no one was watching. Now, everyone was. The marriage didn't survive it. At first, Ethan clung to Lena, united by shared exposure and resentment. But fear has a way of turning inward. Blame followed. Accusations replaced coordination. Trust, thin to begin with, collapsed under the weight of consequences neither of them could outrun. By the time the separation papers were filed, Hank no longer needed updates. The fracture had been inevitable. He didn't celebrate any of it. What surprised him was how little he felt. Not numbness, not relief, just resolution. One evening, Hank sat alone in his living room, reviewing the final confirmations from Susan. Everything was complete. All authority restored. Every safeguard in place. The machinery that had once been used against him now answered only to him. He thought back to the hospital exit. The wheelchair. The glass doors opening and closing as other people left with family. He remembered the confusion, the quiet shame, the way he'd convinced himself it was temporary. That version of himself felt distant now. Not weaker, just uninformed. Hank stood and walked through his house. Slower than he used to, but steadier than he'd been in weeks. Each room felt like his again. Not because his name was on the deed, but because no one else's hand hovered over it. Later that night, he poured himself a drink and raised the glass not in toast, but acknowledgement. He had lost a son in every way that mattered long before the paperwork caught up. What he had gained was clarity, autonomy, the certainty that no one would ever decide his life for him again. The phone buzzed once on the table. A message from Susan. Everything is finalized. You're fully protected now. Hank set the phone face down and looked out the window at the quiet street beyond. The world hadn't changed. People still made plans, still underestimated others, still mistook patience for weakness. He knew better now. And as the night settled in around him, Hank understood that this wasn't the end of what had been taken or what he would reclaim. It was simply the moment when nothing and no one stood between him and his own decisions ever again. Recovery came differently this time. Not rushed, not ignored, not handled in the margins of someone else's priorities. Hank followed the doctor's instructions to the letter now. Physical therapy 3 times a week. Medication taken on schedule. Meals planned instead of improvised. Each day he felt a little more strength return to his body, not all at once, but enough to notice, enough to trust. The pain receded from a constant presence to an occasional reminder, and even that began to fade. With his body came his balance. The fog that had hung over him in the weeks after surgery lifted. His thoughts sharpened. His posture changed. He walked farther, stood longer, felt steadier on his feet. The man in the mirror didn't look younger, but he looked whole again. In control of himself, confidence followed naturally. Not the brittle kind that needed to prove anything, the quiet kind that settled into his movements, his decisions, his voice. When he spoke now, people listened without questioning his authority. When he paused, they waited. He reached out to people he hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends from the early days of the company. Men who remembered muddy job sites and shared risks. They met for coffee, then lunch, then longer conversations that drifted into evening. No agendas, no hidden angles, just familiarity returning to places it had once belonged. Those reconnections reminded him of who he'd been before responsibility narrowed his world. Selling the company came next. Not in a rush, not under pressure. Hank worked with Mark to evaluate offers, rejecting most of them without explanation. He chose buyers who respected what had been built, who understood the value of steady leadership and long-term thinking. The final deal reflected Hank's terms fair, clean, and time to his choosing. When the papers were signed, he felt no loss. Only completion. Independent living wasn't a reaction anymore. It was a plan. Hank downsized, but this time by choice. A smaller place with light and space, and neighbors who knew his name. Everything arranged to support him, not contain him. No one spoke for him. No one monitored him. The decisions were his. All of them. Peace grew quietly. Morning stretched longer. Evening softened. The constant vigilance that had kept him alert for betrayal loosened its grip. He slept better, laughed more easily. The anger that had once burned so hot now felt distant, like something from another life. Sometimes, memories surfaced uninvited: the hospital exit, the unanswered calls, Ethan's voice breaking in that quiet room. Hank let them pass without resistance. They no longer demanded anything from him. One afternoon, sitting on his balcony with a cup of coffee cooling beside him, Hank realized he hadn't thought about money or control all day. That was new. The power he held now wasn't tied to assets or authority. It was rooted in self-trust, in the knowledge that he could rebuild his life without leaning on people who saw him as expendable. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street below, Hank felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Contentment, not relief, not victory. Peace. And yet, beneath it, there was still awareness. A quiet understanding that independence wasn't just a state. It was something that had to be protected. Hank took a slow breath and leaned back in his chair, watching the day end on his own terms. Whatever came next, he would meet it standing. Ethan showed up on a quiet afternoon, unannounced. Hank was in the middle of watering the small row of plants on his balcony when the intercom buzzed. He set the watering can down and stood there for a moment, already knowing who it would be. He didn't rush to answer. When he finally pressed the button, his voice was calm. "Yes, it's me," Ethan said. No confidence this time. No impatience. Just a flat honesty that hadn't been there in years. "I was hoping we could talk." Hank buzzed him in. Ethan stood awkwardly in the doorway a minute later, hands in his pockets, eyes darting around the apartment as if taking inventory. He looked thinner, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The man who'd once spoken like an authority now waited to be acknowledged. Hank stepped aside to let him in, then returned to his chair without offering a seat. He said nothing. "I won't take much of your time," Ethan began, clearing his throat. I needed to say this in person." Hank folded his hands loosely in his lap and waited. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. The words came without decoration. No explanations followed. No justifications. "What I did was wrong. I should have stopped it. I should have listened to you." Silence filled the room. Hank didn't nod, didn't reject it. He simply let the apology sit where it landed. Ethan shifted his weight. "I'm not asking for anything," he added quickly. "I know I don't have the right. I just wanted you to hear it." Hank studied his son carefully. There was no performance in his voice this time. No strategy, just regret, raw and exposed. It didn't erase anything, but it was real. "You don't get money from me," Hank said finally. His voice was steady, not unkind. "You don't get access. You don't make decisions for me, ever." Ethan nodded immediately. "I know. If we talk," Hank continued, "it's without leverage. No expectations. No favors." "I understand," Ethan said. His eyes were wet now, but he didn't look away. Hank leaned forward slightly. "And if you lie to me again," he added, "we don't talk at all." Ethan swallowed hard. "I won't." The room fell quiet again. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Somewhere, someone laughed. Life went on, indifferent to their small, fragile moment. Hank stood and opened the door. Not as a dismissal, but as an ending to the conversation. "That's all I can offer," he said. "Honesty. Nothing else." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you for letting me say it," he said softly. As he stepped into the hallway, he turned back once. "I don't expect things to go back," he said. "I just hope they can be something." Hank met his eyes. "We'll see." The door closed quietly behind Ethan. Hank returned to the balcony and picked up the watering can, finishing what he'd started. His hands didn't shake. His chest didn't tighten. The meeting hadn't reopened old wounds, but it hadn't healed them either. It had simply defined the ground they stood on now. Whether anything would grow, there was still an open question. Hank moved on a clear morning, the kind that made the city feel newly washed. The new place wasn't large. It didn't need to be. Sunlight poured in through wide windows, catching on clean walls and simple furniture chosen for comfort instead of status. Every decision about the space had been his. What stayed, what went, what mattered enough to bring forward. The absence of excess felt like relief. He set his belongings down slowly, taking his time. There was no rush, no one waiting on him to finish. The quiet was his, not the kind that echoed with loneliness, but the kind that invited thought. When he opened the balcony doors, fresh air filled the room, and with it, a sense of beginning. Neighbors introduced themselves without hesitation. They knew his name before he offered it. Some recognized him from his work, others from the simple fact that he showed up at the cafe downstairs, at the park in the evenings, at the local hardware store where conversations still happened face to face. Respect returned not as deference, but as acknowledgement. Hank's health continued to improve in ways he could feel. His steps grew surer, his breathing steadied. He woke each morning without the tight knot of anticipation he'd lived with for weeks. The body healed faster when the mind wasn't braced for impact. There was no dependence now. He paid his own bills, scheduled his own appointments, made his own plans. Help was available if he wanted it, not imposed because someone else decided he needed it. That distinction mattered more than he'd ever expected. Fear lost its hold gradually, then all at once. The fear of being sidelined, of being spoken over, of being treated like a problem instead of a person. Each day without it felt like reclaimed ground. Strength returned, not the kind measured in muscle or authority, but the kind that came from standing firmly inside one's own life. Hank noticed it in small moments, the ease with which he declined invitations he didn't want, the confidence with which he accepted those he did, the way he met people's eyes without bracing for manipulation. One afternoon, standing in his new kitchen, Hank realized something had shifted permanently. He no longer checked his phone out of habit, no longer waited for updates or warnings. The vigilance that had once kept him safe was no longer required. He had built a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or presence. As evening settled in, Hank sat by the window and watched the city lights come alive. Cars moved steadily below. Voices drifted up from the street. Life unfolded around him, unspectacular and solid. He felt no urge to control it. This was independence, not isolation, not withdrawal, but choice. The freedom to engage or step back as he saw fit. Hank took a deep breath and let it out slowly. For the first time since the night at the hospital, there was nothing chasing him, and nothing left to run from. Hank returned to the memory without bitterness. It came to him one evening as he sat alone by the window. The city below softened by distance and light. The hospital night rose clearly, the wheelchair by the exit. The automatic doors sighing open and closed. Families gathering their people and leaving together. He remembered the way hope had thinned with each passing hour, replaced first by embarrassment, then by something colder. At the time, he'd thought that night marked the moment he was abandoned. Now, he understood it had been something else entirely. It had been the moment he was shown the truth. If Ethan had come, if Lena had smiled and played their part a little longer, if someone had picked him up, driven him home, tucked him neatly back into his old life, none of what followed would have happened. The accounts would have continued to move quietly. The authority would have shifted cleanly. His relevance would have faded without resistance. Being left behind hadn't been cruelty. It had been a mistake. The betrayal forced clarity, where comfort would have kept him blind. It stripped away assumptions he'd mistaken for love and replaced them with something harder but honest. He saw now that affection without respect was just proximity, habit, convenience. And when circumstances changed, so did its limits. Love without respect was useless. Hank had learned that power didn't announce itself. It didn't raise its voice or demand recognition. Real power waited, it observed. It acted only when necessary. And when it did, it moved without hesitation. The people who had tried to take his life apart had mistaken quiet for weakness, patience for decline. They had been wrong. Survival, he realized, wasn't about strength in the way people talked about it. It wasn't about fighting every battle or guarding every door. It was awareness, the ability to notice when something felt off, to question what others insisted was normal, to recognize when trust was being used as leverage. That awareness had cost him something he would never get back. A relationship, an illusion, the belief that time and effort alone guaranteed loyalty, but it had given him everything else. Hank stood and walked through his home, unhurried. Each step felt earned. The walls didn't close in on him. The silence didn't accuse him. This life, smaller, quieter, chosen, belonged to him completely. He thought of the man who had sat in that wheelchair, phone in hand, telling himself they were just running late. That man had believed he was waiting to be rescued. Hank smiled faintly at the memory. That man didn't need rescuing. He needed to be left alone long enough to see clearly. The irony settled in gently, without bitterness. The night meant to sideline him had given him leverage. The absence meant to diminish him had restored his authority. The people who assumed he wouldn't notice had given him all the evidence he needed. They had walked away from him at the hospital doors, believing the story was already written. They never imagined he would rewrite it without them. Hank turned off the light and let the room fall into darkness, comfortable and complete. Tomorrow would come, like every other day now, without fear, without dependence, without someone else shaping its outcome. The man they thought they'd left behind hadn't disappeared. He had walked away with everything that mattered. And this time, he wasn't waiting for anyone to follow.